Hi, welcome to the Diablo podcast. I'm your host, Flux, and we are online at diabloincgamers.com. I'm joined this week by Wolfpaq
Hello.
and by Azzure,
Howdy.
and he's coming all the way from Australia, where it's already next week. How is the weather next week, by the way?
Sunny. Pretty sunny.
It's always tomorrow where you live. Okay, we're going to cover a bunch of stuff about the V108 patch previews, the itemization, stuff about increasing monster density or improving monster density at least, since I suppose somebody might think increasing is not an improvement, although they would be wrong, much like Azzure will be about some of his later points. And co-op experience and other stuff. I wanted to briefly mention, we were just chatting before we started recording here about the SimCity launch, which was a debacle, and I just posted a news thing about that saying, people are pissed because there's the whole DRM online-only thing, and that's why no one could play it for the past week. But you said you're playing it right now, Azzure? Or you were?
For the first time, it's actually working. There's still a few cutouts here and there, but it's kind of working. I think EA and Maxis have set back the DRM movement about 5 years with this launch. I don't think anyone's going to tolerate DRM after this.
So it's now 10 years back when you add the 6 years that Diablo III set it back.
Correct.
Have you any Wolfpaq for you, SimCity, or vice versa there?
No, I didn't really play any of the franchise years ago, so I had no interest in getting it now.
Yeah, well, that makes two of us. So the big sell, I mean, at least for the Diablo 3, they could say, we all played Diablo 2 online. Most of us had saved characters on Battle.net. So it wasn't like a whole new direction. It was just like, you can only do this now because, piracy. Of course, they didn't say that, but, that was kind of the subtext. But SimCity, it seems like, isn't it always been a single-player game, Azzure, basically? I mean, now they're just sort of, they've added in some features for MP, but basically everyone just thinks it's the online-only DRM piracy thing.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it almost looks like a lot of effort was put in to make the DRM appear to be more sort of tailored towards multiplayer. And it feels a bit forced. I mean, it does have full support for it, like you can trade and all that sort of stuff, but realistically, a SimCity game is about single player, building your own cities, trading with yourself, with your other cities, and it's kind of forced on it's sort of tacked on multiplayer, I think.
And of course, it's online only, and it didn't work for the first week, so people are pissed.
Pissed.
So the question I have basically is, since we're seeing, the Diablo console now is going to be, it's online only, except you can play it on your own computer, on your own console. There's like a limited single player. It's not a TCP/IP kind of thing, but you can play single player or with other people on your machine. So imagine if Diablo 3 had launched with a DRM basically like what the Diablo console is going to have. There's no LAN, there's no TCP/IP, but you can play purely single player by yourself on your own machine. Would we still have seen such massive hatred and complaints, or would it have been much better? Wolfpaq.
I think it would have been a lot better. I mean, obviously, a lot of people really miss playing LAN games together, especially since
I said no LAN, though. That's the whole criteria.
Then...
So it's only single player on your machine. Well, I mean, because Blizzard said no LAN TCP/IP because that gives you the multiplayer code and it's easier to hack Battle.net with, which may or may not be true. But I mean, just saying only by yourself or what we have right now on Battle.net.
Okay, well, there would have been less for sure because a lot of people have said, I mean, I don't know if they're being honest or not, but a lot of people have said that their biggest complaint is the ping between them and Blizzard's servers and wanting to play while they're on the train or because they don't have a good internet connection or whether, for whatever reason, they want to be able to play the game by themselves with no worries about latency. So, yeah, I think there would have been a lot less feedback, even though for multiplayer they would have to hop on Battle.net. I think, yeah, because of the single player community, which is not insubstantial, would have been appeased with...
It is now.
Yeah, that's very true.
It didn't used to be, but... Okay, so Azzure, since you come from the homeland of bad ping, what do you think?
I agree with Wolfpaq. I think people would have still complained, though. Not as much, obviously, because it would have acted a bit like a distraction if they did have single player. Like, it would be like, the server's down, but at least I can do something for the next, few days or hours or whatever. But I think people still would have been upset because I think most players do want to have a multiplayer character so they can do things like trading and play with friends and stuff like that. So I think the fundamental problem would have still been there, but the whining and the sort of going crazy of gamers would have been much reduced if there was something to keep them entertained for a while.
don't you think a lot of it were people who just had the knives out for Diablo 3 or for Blizzard or whatever, and they were like, well, here's what we're going to complain. It's kind of like how, once
Mm,
Jay Wilson quit, he was the fault, and then
yeah,
then the console was the fault.
yeah,
I mean, obviously, it had what, 20,000 Metacritic reviews with a .07 average or something like that. That wasn't just, hey, I can't connect online for 6 hours, therefore it's the worst game ever made. I mean, there was a
yeah.
lot more going on there than just that.
Even some gaming sites actually gave purposely low scores because of that issue. So, if the gaming sites are going to sort of get angry and be irrational, then imagine the general public. We're not known for our rationality when it comes to not being able to play a game that we've been waiting, 7 years for. So
Yeah.
I think, Metacritic user reviews are very accurate of how a game is, as we all know.
Yeah, and it's like point 0.1 point, it's like 1.4 or something of SimCity with 5,000 reviews because they
Yeah.
couldn't log on for a week, therefore the game is horrible.
Hmm.
But if you paid your $60 and you can't play, then I guess people get pissed.
Mm.
Okay, that was a whole side point. Now we're going to get into the main topics here of 108 stuff. Just wondering about that because I posted a thing on that in the news shortly before we started recording here. So 108 features itemization blog was the big thing that came out. We'll get to your horrible idea about SOJ fragments in a little bit, Azzure. So can you save on that?
Sure.
Your fanifesto can go forth. But I mean, there's obviously a lot of features on this. We're going to cover most of these points they've been bringing up in the item blog and stuff. But I'm kind of soliloquying here, so I'll throw it to one of you guys right at the start. But one of the main points about loot and improvements: less loot, better quality loot. What would you think about that, Wolfpaq? Are you enough rares in the game for you
Oh
now?
yeah. No, I mean I've gotten to the point I think like a lot of people have where I pick up nothing but rares and of course sets and legendaries when they do drop. But I mean your inventory fills with them so quickly and then you have to spend so much time identifying every single one. And granted it's only 1 second, but your inventory can fit a lot more gear now. So it's like 20 30 seconds a run devoted to doing nothing but identifying and then it's all crap. It's like I've been playing a lot since 1.07 came out because I really like the demonic essences and the crafting, but man, I have not found a single rare even worth posting on the auction house, let alone using. It's just really bad. So yeah, less would be better for sure.
What do you think, Azzure?
Oh, I totally agree. I think it'd be hard to argue against the fact that there's that many rares and that much identifying when you literally keep nothing, and they're absolutely useless for the most part. I mean, you can't even salvage them because the crafting system doesn't work. So there is just too much, I guess, logistics for something for not enough gain. So a lot of people, as you know, I think you do this, Flux, you sort of just only pick up the high level 6-3 stuff or certain slots. And that's kind of terrible. Like to have
Yeah.
players have to do that is really terrible. Rares are supposed to be, ooh, shiny, something that you sort of get a little bit excited about. Not as much as a legendary, but I think if they do reduce the amount of rares drastically, and I think they mentioned about 75% on the blog. I think he was using an example, so he might not have meant it literally. But if they did do that, I mean, you'd see champion packs, no longer just dropping 2, 3 rares every time. You'd see them dropping sort of none or one, which I think would actually feel a lot better. Obviously, the stats of those items are going to be superior to what we're used to. I do think it's a good change. It's one of the changes I completely agree with.
And that, of course, has to go with, better rares and fewer rares go together. You can't have the same number of rares and better rares, or else
No.
it'll still feel like spam. And then
Yep.
suddenly, this is something you're always going on about, Azure. You're just raising the floor that way.
Yeah. Yep.
So,
That's right.
if there's 1 to 100 of quality, and now you only get 80 to 100 of quality, 80 becomes the new 1 pretty quickly if you're finding
Yes.
50 of those a game.
Exactly.
But of course, you're happier in the meantime. I was thinking about this point before the podcast, and they actually did a lot of that sort of improvement in Diablo 3. I mean, if you recall Diablo 2, you'd get like, leech on wands, and there were lots of mods that weren't just suboptimal; they were completely functionless.
Mm.
And they did a lot of work in D3 to make those more focused. I mean, you still get things you don't really want. You get strength and intelligence on bows and stuff,
Mm.
but those have some function. I mean, they're just bad because they're there in place of something real that could
Yeah.
potentially be much better. But it's not like you find 100 completely useless. You're not getting like thorns on weapons and stuff in
Mm.
D2, in D3, and you get that in D2 all the time.
Yeah.
But
So
obviously that could be better, and they could make it a little less junk.
that's a lovely ringtone.
Sorry about
So
that.
to go on to that point, Flux, there's a big difference between D2 and D3 in that respect. In D3, itemization is much, much more powerful than it was in D2. You know, the difference between a character who's fresh into Inferno and the difference between someone who's been in Inferno on like MP50 or something is almost like 50 times the DPS. Now, Diablo 2 was totally different. The itemization did make your character more powerful, but it didn't make it, it wasn't as important in terms of character strength. I mean, you could get away with using magical stuff in Hell, for example, as long as you had a lot of, you know, you had enough life and enough
But there
damage.
were there were reasons to use that. I mean, I mean, like you could get higher MF on magical rings
Mm.
and amulets than you could get on rares or uniques in D2.
Yeah, and I mean the entire item system in D2 is very different to how it is in D3. I mean, in D2 you could actually do things like pick up some crappy unique item because it's got a lot of MF on it, and that's your helmet. See, with D3 you can't do that because you lose way too many stats, and it sort of weakens your character by a huge portion of strength. You can't just sort of bypass slots like you could in D2 because the itemization had so much more weight in it in D3, which you know, it's a good thing and a bad thing. I think they kind of shot themselves in the foot with D3 because there's so much damage inflation. You know, we're running around with 300k DPS, you know, and that's considered pretty low now compared to when we first jumped into Inferno with like 10k DPS, and it's just a much, much different type of item system than it was in D2.
Well, I don't know if I agree with some of these points being expressed. I played a lightning sorceress in Diablo 2, and by the time I had finished putting my rune words together, I had lightning doing over, and oh, and of course the grand charms. I think I was up to like 31,000 damaged lightnings versus the sorceress that you're talking about that doesn't optimize with the charms and doesn't have the optimal plus stats and maxed synergies and everything would be closer to 4 or 5,000 per lightning. So it can, I mean, the gear made a huge difference in Diablo 2 as well.
Part of the thing we had this whole discussion, months and months ago, and just because Inferno was so much harder in D3 than D2's Hell was.
Right.
So
Mm.
you actually needed, especially early on in D3, everyone just said, gear check, gear check, gear check was the complaint for,
Yeah,
like the first four
Yeah.
months.
But that's
And you never, in D2, you could just go to hell and trample stuff. And
yeah,
that's actually kind of what they've turned D3 into. Like on
right.
MP0, it's much easier than it used to
Yeah,
be.
I mean,
yeah.
you can do that stuff and go on MP0. In fact, one of my favorite things to do now is play a Archon wizard, and the great thing about it is she dominates monster powers like 0 through 2. She's amazing, and then as soon as you get like 2 monster power steps up, it falls off really quickly because I'm simply not killing monsters fast enough to keep Archon up. But when I get better gear, I'll gradually be able to work my way up, although probably not to the top tier unless I get some sort of ridiculously lucky with my drops. But anyways, it's I think, yeah, like Flux just said, Diablo 3 is a lot more now with the monster power system what Diablo 2 was back when we played it.
I think the monster power system had to come in because of such a wide variety of DPS. So, for example, before there was monster power, like you said, Flux, you would have to absolutely min max your gear perfectly so you could actually even survive a few hits. And they've obviously pushed that back to the MP system, which allows you to have a wide array of DPS players where you can actually run into Inferno with, say 10k DPS and be fine. Whereas you go to MP 10 and 400k DPS is not good enough. D2 didn't have to do that because the gap was a lot smaller. The difference between, like you were saying, Wolfpaq, the difference in with your lightning sorceress, you said about 25,000 damage or 40,000 damage, whereas a normal sort of geared sorceress would do, say, 5,000 damage. That's only a factor of about 5 to 6 times. I'm talking, difference between 10k DPS and 600k DPS or 400k DPS. It's a factor of 40 times, and I think that's why the MP system had to be put in, because there is no way you can balance the game around the variance between 10k DPS and 400k DPS without ruining it for one of the parties. And obviously it was geared to, at the beginning it was geared towards the higher the higher DPS to even survive and to kill, and they've sort of brought it to 10 different sort of power levels just to be able to cater for such different item variants in the game. And I think that's obviously a part of how the item system differs with D3 and D2.
Well, there's,
Wh-
if you don't mind, just a couple points there. Like the character sheet DPS is not the same as effective DPS, and
No, that's right.
like uh, wizards, for example, the
You keep saying wizards. Is that a class in Diablo 3? I haven't seen those in a while. Those are still in the
yeah,
game?
oh, they absolutely are.
Apparently.
Okay,
Critical
go ahead.
critical mass wizards tend to have much lower DPS than say Archon wizards, but they character sheet DPS, but actually critical mass wizards are the ones that are capable of soloing the higher monster powers. And 10k DPS is an extreme under example of you could spend I don't know I can't 10k DPS is just really low. Like that's the
Yeah,
number.
I get like 35k for my gloves, so
Yeah,
Yeah, now
exactly.
you do.
Like
Yeah, but
if
sorry,
you're
you go, you go.
well, if you just pick a class, like I'm playing a demon hunter, that's my main. So the worst I've started playing public games now actually that you can get into public games with monster power levels up. I've never seen a demon hunter below like 150,000 DPS. Like it's
Mm.
very very rare, and it's very
Yeah, it
easy
is now.
to
Yeah.
top that. Yeah, yeah. I mean, we're talking about 1.8. You know, the state of the game as it is and how it will be. It's just yeah, 150k versus 600k. You know, is around the factor. 600k is probably one of the top. Like a godly geared demon hunter will be around 600k, but that's like top of the line and really really difficult to get. But that's about the same factor as the sorcerers I was talking about from Diablo 2.
I must be doing something wrong because my my demon hunter, who's pretty well geared, only currently does 40k DPS. I think I've been
Well,
neglecting her a bit too much.
okay, maybe
But
maybe
mine's
I
at
do remember
170 and I'm not even playing her, so
I
yeah.
do remember before MP and all that sort of stuff happened, my Barbarian, this is like sort of within, say, 4 weeks of the game's release, my Barbarian was in Inferno, and I think they had about 10k DPS, and that was considered quite good back then. I think my point is being that item inflation and damage inflation is so quick and so high in Diablo 3 than it was in D2, where the difference between a maximum geared character on eye level 6 3 gear with maximum stats versus a eye level 60 character who's got level 60 original sort of self-found gear is huge. I mean, without the auction house, you will probably see 90% of players at just hitting level 60 having about 10k DPS. The auction house obviously gives you the ability to very easily and cheaply get this sort of set of gear that is much higher than the average you would find if you were sort of doing it yourself. And that's sort of the point I'm alluding to, where the range between what a natural level 60 gear set looks like and the difference between an auction house level 60 gear set is enormous.
That's true.
but everybody has an auction house gear set now, so well, not
Exactly.
everybody, but
That's
vast majority of.
yeah.
The other thing on that flashback point there, Wolfpaq's talking about, D2X, 9 patches in where you've got, 10 charms for skill levels and everything else. I mean, that's a very specialized level of the game. If you go back to D2C 8 months after release, like, we have D3C at this point, you wouldn't have seen anywhere near that much of a variance in characters. And
That's true.
God knows what we'll see in, another 2 or 3 years of Diablo 3 and some expansions and more patches. There'll be talismans and all kinds of,
Yeah.
super. So it'll probably
Yeah.
be even more so of what we're talking about here. But
Yep.
okay, next point. Legendaries. Improved legendaries.
Suck.
They're talking about making them better. The thing they said in the items blog, I didn't really see how it would help that much, actually. People didn't seem too enthused about the idea of. I mean, for one thing, they said, special cool features on legendaries that you can't get on other items, which has only been the main complaint since like 2002,
Yeah.
I mean, okay, it's nice they're finally catching. It's nice they're saying all the stuff we agree with now, but it's like, at the same time, it's like, yeah, where was that, like, 2009? Where was this,
Yeah.
It's really cool in D2. You find lots of, it's funny. I remember for a while before D3 launched, I kept like writing articles saying we shouldn't keep comparing this game to D2 because it's very different. They've changed so much.
Yeah.
And now every single goddamn argument is because in D2 X
Yeah.
was, including by me. So it's funny how we've come back around to this. Mainly as every feature in D3 is gradually turning into D2 7.0 or something.
Yep.
But the whole fun thing with legendaries in D2, and some of them at least, was you had O skill things and other stuff that would grant you skills of other characters, or you just would find an item. You'd find your legendary. I'm blanking on all the names. Titan's Revenge. It's like, okay, time to make a Javazon. There were just individual items that were so good for certain builds that just you would immediately say, okay, now I have to make this build. And there's not a single item in Diablo 3 that does that I can think of.
Not at
No.
all.
I mean, there's great items, but I mean, there's not like a claw that gives you like plus 50% damage to sweeping wind and tempest rush or something like that, where you would immediately want to make a monk who used those two skills.
Yeah. And
And people want that, and it will be fun.
I fundamentally think the reason that happened is the actual item system in Diablo 3, especially with the legendaries and sets, was poorly designed in that respect, because what the type of thing I guess the community as a whole wants to see, and the type of thing we saw in D2 and what made it so successful, is legendaries slash uniques were so unique, and it's, pardon the pun of saying
Like
unique,
legendary.
was so unique that you actually were able to make sort of gimmicky type gameplay builds that relied on those items, and you can actually create a character that would completely rely on that set of gear because it was so unique, and you could create builds that would never ever work without these types of gears. Diablo 3, you could almost it is almost the case with every class where you can just keep the gear you've got at the current state of the game. You can keep whatever you've got, change your build, and it will be just as good as it was with the same gear. So the gear doesn't actually affect the build at all. I mean, there's some small examples of that, but it's nowhere near to the scope of what I think it should be and what Diablo 2 was. And that's, I think, is ultimately from poor legendary slash set item design.
You want to jump in there,
Yeah,
Wolfpaq?
no, I totally agree. The depth from Diablo 2 wasn't in the skill system or in the stat points. It was in finding skills that worked with items, and they complemented each other. And the reason everyone's saying Diablo 3 is a shallow game is because the item variety
Because
is just
console.
not, no. Well, now, yes.
Because
but,
DRM.
yeah, I mean,
Because Jay Wilson.
no.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's the items. I mean, the items are just really, really bland. And even after the legendary change, ooh, the Tormentor staff has a chance to charm enemies. There's no one making a charm build because there's no skills in the game that complement that. Like even the Frostburn gauntlets, they are, they can go up to
Worst legendary in the
yeah,
game.
well, they can go up to 30% cold damage and an additional 6% added on, and it's still nowhere close to as good as a decent pair of Int trifecta gloves. And so they just,
Or Frostburns in Diablo 2.
yeah, yeah, exactly. The infinite mana gloves. So, but I mean, from what they've said in the item blog, having a wizard source that lets you have two hydras at once, that's a great start in my opinion. Or the barb helm that'll let the Call of the Ancients last until until they die. Like that's really cool. That's game changing right there. So I think they're realizing they need to go in the next step. It's almost like they need to come up with new rune effects and then just put those rune effects on items. And I think that's good.
Something that does concern me with that change in general is I'm worried that they'll design it in a way, and this again would be out of I guess inexperience in what actually makes Diablo games fun, is if they did something like created items that are specifically for exactly that build. Like, for example, if they made, I don't know, a meteor sort of weapon that says, plus, your meteor does 30% damage, and that's why if you do a meteor, you have to have this weapon, and that's it. I hope they do it in a more intelligent way, and the way sort of D2 did it is they didn't really put things in that are so obvious. They wouldn't say, okay, well, if you use this weapon, then you definitely have to go this build, and it's awesome for this build. They actually did it in the way they designed the classes. For example, a Javazon valued increased attack speed much higher than it valued DPS, actual raw DPS, because the javelins cascaded off each other and did lightning damage, which didn't have any effect on your actual character dole DPS. And so therefore, frequency was better than actual damage. So that means, fast IS was awesome for a Javazon, weapon damage was useless for a Javazon. And they're the types of things that I think are quite cool, because they actually open up a bit of creativity in designing your character, rather than just saying, okay, well, this is the meteor wand. If you don't have this wand, then your meteor build's going to suck. I'm hoping they don't go that far.
And of course, in D3, you'd have to get huge DPS as well on that weapon, or else it would still suck.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Because we don't have casting speed and spell damage, so that's just. I mean, maybe the expansion might bring that back, but that's not an option. So we'll have to find other ways to get around that. Or maybe you put those features on armor. It adds. Like the whole thing with you get two hydras now instead, or you get your blizzards can stack, or you get 50% radius increase to whatever. And if you put it on the weapon, you don't get good DPS. You'll never ever use it, no matter what.
Yeah.
But if you put it on other items, you might find some way to get it in there still.
Well, yeah, if you were going to make an Amazon around Titan's Revenge, there's one skill you're going to use. I mean, that's how I play games. That item was clearly designed for an
Yeah.
Amazon to use Lightning Fury. Like, you're not going to be. I mean, people tried to do poison lightning builds, of course, but they were completely suboptimal and not using the item to its, max potential.
Okay, one other thing about legendaries that's an issue is many of the slots there's a required mod. Like if you don't get a socket and a helm, it's useless.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't get, you don't necessarily need a trifecta, but you need at least like 2 legs of a trifecta on like rings, amulets, or gloves, or else it's useless.
Yep.
And so, and other stuff, kind of the problem with that is, so do you guarantee that? But if you guarantee those, then there's just sort of a power creep, and like mana cores are a good example. You know, it's like the biggest damage crossbow in the game, and they always have critical damage and always have at least one socket. If mana cores didn't have either of those as a default, if you found one with those 2 mods, it'd be an awesome item. Otherwise, they'd be junk. Whereas now, if you get one without really good CD and DPS and maybe even 2 sockets, it's junk.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it just postpones the junkiness. You know, you're just raising the floor a little bit, but the ceiling is still
This-
up out of sight.
This is why I maintain that the fundamental problem is the auction house. It's not actually the items themselves, because no matter what you do, like you said, if you made them all have the same stats roughly, and they didn't vary so much, then the same thing would happen. The auction house still offers an easy avenue for those items to circulate, and as long as that continues on, there is nothing that they can do to stop that or to even slow that. The auction house fundamentally that's what it does. It brings all the items into one gigantic pool, so that the best items are the things that people value, and therefore are the things that almost make it so everything else is useless. And that's the issue I'm sort of trying to get across in when I speak to other people about why adding extra powerful items won't actually, or even increasing the chance of finding your own really powerful items will not actually help the problem with the auction house superseding the finding yourself found items and finding things yourself. It's the fundamental way the auction house operates that is the problem. And solutions for that are obviously very, very difficult, because they're not going to remove the auction house. No one wants to see them do that. But that problem is going to continue happening no matter how cool and how different the item system becomes, because that's just the way it functionally works.
You have a counterpoint, Wolfpack?
Well, I'm not. At you though, the way I don't in the way I've always gotten gear in games like this is trading. The auction house just makes trading easier. I don't see it as a problem as much as, I mean, maybe I don't know. I don't see convenience as a problem, because in Diablo 2, instead of listing your items and spending 10 minutes a day working on auctions, which is what I do now. As some people make the auction house a game that they play for hours. I don't do that, but in Diablo 2, you would need to just actually spend hours joining trade games, spamming third-party sites, forums, D2 JSP, all that other nonsense. And I really, really didn't like it. And I maintain the auction house is the best upgrade from D2 to D3.
Yeah. On a
Controversial point.
on the convenience side, I totally agree. I mean, no one wants to go back to the days of spamming chat and going to D2 JSP and that sort of stuff. It's just that we're sort of paying for that with a sort of not as entertaining item system, I think, is that's what we're paying for this auction house with. And a lot of people don't like that. I personally think that it's more of a long-term issue with the game, because items, I mean, we've seen a taste of itemization being very stale, and I think if you can imagine a world where there was no auction house and you had to find your own rares, it would actually, and that's what Travis said in his blog as well, it would actually change the game for the better in terms of the item hunt. The item hunt will feel a lot better, and that's superior to how it is now. But that's not to say that not having an auction house is fine, because not having an auction house will cause its own set of problems and will make trading hard again. So my suggestion is definitely not to remove the auction house. But I do think if we do want to have an item system that is fun and you get excited when you find really good items, there has to be some kind of limitation to the auction house in its convenience that it offers.
Well, the problem with the item system is that the items are bad. It's not that there's an auction house, it's they're poorly designed. Like, I've found maybe 50, no, let's say since I started playing again in 1.07, I've found like 10 legendaries, and one of them has been good, out of the 10. Like, that's
And does that mean it was good enough to sell or
Yeah.
to
Good
use?
enough to use. It was an upgrade to my quiver
Oh
on
my
my
God,
demon hunter.
really?
Yeah, I was like,
Well, that's one more than
yeah,
I
I was
found.
like,
And
wow. I was in complete shock, and
mm,
that's again, I mean, that's a problem. I mean, it, I don't own top of
Well,
the
that's a
line,
but
problem
that's
because
it
your demon hunter is so well geared from
from
the
the
auction
auction
house that it's
house.
really hard
Yeah,
to find an upgrade.
that's
but no,
exactly
but
right.
If you had much lower quality gear, you'd
I
find
mean,
more
I'm
upgrades.
finding things like a legendary one-handed spear with 600 DPS. Like that's
Trash.
yeah, it's trash.
As soon as you said legendary spear, I was like
Yeah,
trash.
it can't be good.
Now, if there was a legendary spear that could roll a socket, that could have crit damage, that I mean, I know we have one that increases the barbarian spear skills, but
No one uses them anyway.
and yeah, no one
Yeah,
uses
yeah, with
those skills.
407 DPS, great.
Yeah, I mean, if there would if there was this wizard source came out, and see the main problem is in Diablo 2, legendaries or uniques didn't have this wild range of effectiveness where it can go from complete garbage to godliness. Like the Shaco,
Yeah.
the helm that all the casters used,
So
was pretty much the only difference was the armor value, which was like a difference of 15, or like so
yeah,
everyone who got a Shaco knew a Shaco is good. If there was an auction house in Diablo 2, the Shaco, it'd be all over the auction house, but
it would
finding
be
your own
cheap.
would still be exciting because, hey, I don't have to buy another Shaco.
Yeah,
So,
no.
uh,
This is the part where I sort of disagree with because I think if there was an auction house in Diablo 2, the Shakos would be so common and so unexciting to find because you can literally just go to the auction house and buy them for a super super low price because there's literally 10,000 of them sitting there, and that's sort of a side effect of the auction house and why D2's item system felt a bit better because the items were actually difficult to get because you couldn't just go to an auction house and pick out the perfect shaker you wanted or just any shaker because you had to go out and it was very inaccessible to get one. And when you did find one, it was like, awesome, I actually found one of the best items. And and I've actually can use it and I can keep it. I think the auction house, and then like kind of what like Flux just said to you in terms of the auction, your character, the reason why you probably don't get excited finding legendaries or they're not an upgrade is because your character's already been outfitted from the auction house at a very low price, and you've already got a really high bar of gear. So anything that drops is not going to be exciting for you because you need to find like the 0.001% that is an upgrade for you because the auction house did that to you.
no, I disagree. It's because items like this spear with 70 all resistances and 600 DPS exists as legendaries. I mean, if they designed it well, I mean, because I have 5 characters, one of each class at level 60. I'm not going to go out and spend on the auction house millions of gold on each one because I'm not super rich. So, I mean, I'm not even asking for legendaries to all be godly. I want to find a legendary like Travis said in his blog and get excited. And the fact is, for the majority of legendaries that drop, it's not exciting because they're bad. They're bad. That's it. That's the end of the story. They didn't succeed in making them awesome enough. They made some of them awesome enough, like the Manticore and Triumvirate, and there's tons of good ones, but the bad outweighs the good, and I
Yeah.
can attest that from the playing I've done for the last couple weeks. I found, like I said, one item, and if I didn't use it, I would try to sell it and probably be a little successful. But that's if they made legendaries such that when you find them, it's exciting, and if you can't use it, you could give it to a friend who could make good use of it, or an alt and make good use of it. Then I think that would be a great start to fixing the item system in D3.
So what makes legendaries better? They said the suggestion in the items blog of they would like lower it would be based on the monster level, I guess. Then
Mm,
you would find lower level legendaries with bigger
mm,
stats in Hell and Inferno and vice versa. I'm not really sure how that would help though, because most of the lower level legendaries have terrible
yeah.
stats. Even if it was a level 63 item, it would still suck. And then the problem you'd still get is there's so many legendaries that no matter what the role is, it's never going to be useful. Or even if you find, one of the potentially best ones, like a Vile Ward or Echoing Fury or something, like 1% of those is actually
Mm,
good because there's such a range on the mods.
yeah.
So do we want, like you were saying with the example with the Shaka, which you've all pronounced differently, I noticed. It's a nice, the Harlequin's crest, I'll just say the actual
All right.
name because I'm old school like that. It's the green Shako, Shako. Anyway, that had a very limited range of mods, and they were always awesome. So maybe that's kind of what you're saying with you want better legendaries, Wolfpaq, which means you want if you find a legendary, you know it's not going to be a 600 DPS two-handed axe. It's like yeah, right.
Yeah.
Instead of I mean, there's so many ones. Every time I find Schaefer's hammer, I found about 10 of those. It seems like I always think this is the ultimate revenge on Max for leaving the company. Because here's your Schaefer's hammer, and it's like an 807 two-handed DPS. It's like, are you out of your effing mind? So instead of you find scorns or something, and they're really good. I mean, there's one good two-handed weapon in the entire game, and it's the scorn, because it's always got CD in a socket and huge DPS and huge stats. So maybe other ones just need to be, instead of it being 800 to 1400, they're all 1100 to 1250 or
Yeah.
something.
But do you know why they did that? They did that
Because they hate us. Because of the auction house.
they had to do it. Because if they didn't do it, then there's going to be 50,000 scorns on the auction house at any one time. They're all going to be awesome.
There are
Yeah,
anyway.
Yeah, exactly. That's what there are, but they range in good and bad, and some are cheaper and some are expensive. If they were all flat, you'll just have 50,000 of the same ones, which means they'll all cost, instead of the worst one costing 10,000, the best one costing a billion, they'll all cost 100,000, for example. And that's the
So
problem.
what, BOA then? So how do you make legendaries good and findable without them becoming spam fest on the auction house?
You remove the
Other than BOA.
remove the auction house. It's the only way. Because
That ain't gonna happen.
yeah, exactly. That's the dilemma they're in, I think, and that's why I think they're having a very hard time trying to fix this problem. Again, if you make all legendaries good, you will still have the same problem of the auction house is still the best place to get your weapons or your armors or whatever, because they will be so accessible and so cheap that you will still not find any of your own items. You'll just go on the auction house and pick out whatever you want, and you'll almost be free, especially if they remove all the variability out of it. So the variability was added intentionally by Blizzard to achieve that, to make items have a range. Items that do not change cannot exist in a game like Diablo because of the auction house.
Well, the range needs to be lower. It doesn't
I
have
agree.
to be eliminated.
Tightening
It just needs to be lower.
Yeah.
Like
then-
Flux
So-
said, don't have 800 damage echoing furies. Minimum 1,000, and go from there.
Again, I don't think that'll solve it either, because what will happen then is the stuff with, say, 1100 DPS, say there's a weapon that's got between 1100 and 1200 DPS, anything that's 1100 DPS will be trash, even though it's still good DPS. It'll be trash because there's still 50,000 other items that have between 1100 and 1200 DPS. So the 50,000, the bottom percentile, will still be 10,000 gold in the auction house, and
That's
the upper
fine.
percentile will still be a billion gold. For
That's
example.
fine. It's still an upgrade for my monk, and if I found it, I'd be like, "Yay, an upgrade for my monk!" and I'd give it, and that's a working, good item system. I'd see nothing wrong with that.
Well, there you go then. Okay, suggestion I have for legendaries, which I don't think actually works, but it's a query one. It's a potential. Add a new class of affixes that only spawns on legendaries with higher values. So say instead of 1 to 100 strength, you can get like 150 to 200 strength on a legendary from the random affixes. And there's other ones that are like, say there's a mod that's like the equivalent of Kings from Diablo II, where it adds, that added AR and weapon damage, but there's no AR in D3. So say there's a mod that adds 3 to 6% critical hit damage and 10 to 25% critical hit damage. Sorry, the first one was chance, but you know what I mean. And that can only appear on legendaries. Now, does this make it more interesting to find legendaries? Because maybe like the level 61s and 62s can suddenly get great random mods and be awesome? Or does it just increase... Everybody wants, the Echoing Fury that's got that mod, and no one cares about anything else again.
The same problem will happen.
Of course, Wolfpaq will have exactly the opposite opinion on this, I realize.
Well, if you did that, so for example, if you made it so those stats were really, really good, as opposed to everything else that didn't roll that, then you'd have the same problem. You'd have the bottom percentile of items being vendor trash, so you would have a very high chance of finding the vendor trash, which will make you very unexcited and angry, which is the same problem we're having now, where you find 1% of legendaries are actually good. That same problem will happen because you need to roll those stats, or it will still be trash.
Okay, can you explain why he's wrong, Wolfpaq?
I just don't. So I think we're coming from different approaches about what we're trying to accomplish in Diablo 3. An 1100 DPS Echoing Fury is not trash, and if they eliminated 800 to 1099 DPS Echoing Furies, it still wouldn't be trash. It would still enable my monk to farm, in a much higher monster power than he does now, which is good, right? Which is a growth in power. Now, as for your suggestion um, for the different class of affixes being appended to legendaries, um, I think that is a possible solution. I'm just not. I would want them to move in a direction where their solution for legendaries not being exciting isn't to give them more crit damage, more attack speed. I would want them to find a way to make them interact with skills to open up new builds. And I keep talking about the monk, so I'll just go with it. And um, so there's a skill the monk has that drops a bell. I can't remember the name of it, but they buffed it recently to do an immense amount of damage. Wave of
Wave of
light.
light.
And the problem that my monk friends are still having is that it costs a ridiculous amount of spirit.
70.
So yeah, which is I
Wow.
think.
And one of the runes drops it down to 40. I've been using
Oh,
that
have
lately,
you? Okay.
testing it out.
So I mean, that's still a huge chunk, and it takes a long time to generate that much spirit, even if you've got a decent amount of regen. So if you could have something that says, like an item, a weapon or a monk specific helm that says all your spirit costs are cut by 20%. Like that could be a game changing helm, and monks could get that, and they could put together new builds, because instead of 70
Yeah.
it would be cost 56, which instead of basically half of your resource pool, it'll cost a third of your resource pool. And then that'll open up more avenues. Or maybe they could restrict it, like only your offensive spells that do holy damage, which would rule out things like blinding light and the mantras. So that would really encourage monks to go explore um, other avenues of builds. So that's just an example of a way I would want them to improve
Yeah.
legendaries.
And they've said they're working on that kind of
Yeah.
thing. So
But I agree that just targeting specific skills isn't necessarily the best way. If they could find a way to target groups of skills, like for the wizard, arcane, cold, and fire and damage, that would be pretty awesome.
well, that was Diablo 2, so we don't have that anymore. Yeah, unfortunately, all we have in Diablo 3, we have red skills and green skills and blue skills and purple skills, and they don't actually,
Do anything.
as the damages don't mean anything
Yeah.
anymore. So except for cold,
But this is, there's an
sorry.
opportunity for them to make it mean something again.
Expansion, expansion.
I really hope they change that, because that's something that it's the homogenization of the damage system, which is what's causing a lot of these items to be so bland, because they all influence everything the exact same way and proportionally, which is bad. I mean, it's great for balance, but it's terrible for gameplay.
Yeah.
One funny thing that I thought of when you're mentioning the auction house stuff is a thing Jay Wilson said at some point when they were talking about One with Everything, the monk passive, shortly after launch. They said nobody used that during their testing because it was impossible to find, 4 items that all had arcane resistance or whatever. And once there was an auction house, they didn't have an auction house during most of the testing period because, why would they want to get that working to test it out? It's one of the most important feature in the entire game. But once that was in there, suddenly everybody upon launch had, 700 resistance all with their monks because they could use the auction house to get all the OWE stuff. And that made this skill that was meant as sort of a supplemental oddity a mandatory monks passive, basically. So I think they have a lot of other things in the game that are kind of like that, where these unintended consequences that wouldn't be an issue without an auction house. An auction house is just obviously a freer exchange of items than you could have via trade forums. It's not some magical whole different thing, unless you're the conspiracy theory that they tied drop rates to what's selling and that kind of stuff. But, and I don't buy that too much. But it's just when there is such a free flow of potential items, then people can really specialize. And that's why the game became much too easy or much too hard in some ways, because people can suddenly have, 60% crit instead of, 25% crit from self-found. And that makes all these builds possible. That's why, the spin to win barb is so powerful and the critical mass wizard is so powerful. You could never do that with 20% critical damage. You need like 60% crit, and you could never get 60% crit playing with self-found.
Well, I think a question everyone has to ask themselves is, do they have a problem with how self-found is at the moment? Do you think it's more fun?
Wolfpaq does, yes.
Do you feel that it's much more fun to find your own items rather than buy almost everything, like 99% of your stuff from a list of items on an auction house? And I think for most players, and Travis also said this in his blog, he believes that, and their team believes that it is more fun to find your own items than currently how it is, which is the auction house. So I guess the question everyone has to ask themselves is, what do they prefer? Now, I think most people probably prefer the self-found, because self-found means that you actually get excited with the item hunt itself. It's a part of the game. It's something that we currently don't really have. We sort of go in and find things and we sell most of it on the auction house, and then we use that money to buy whatever we want on the auction house. Self-found is very different in that respect. It's much closer to what Diablo 2 was, and I think that's the key difference in why the item hunt in Diablo 3 is not as exciting as it was in Diablo 2, because there's nothing that makes something less prestigious than looking at a list of 10,000 of the same item in the auction house. I mean, Wind Force was very good because you barely saw it in Diablo 2. You barely saw anyone using it, and when you finally got one, it was awesome. But now, anyone can pick one up for 10,000 gold. It might have crappy stats, but it's still Wind Force.
Yeah, you're the last point here, items in a second, Wolfpaq, so we need to move on to some other topic. But it's funny, like the first 2 months after launch, I was totally anti-auction house and didn't use it at all and tried to be all self-found. And Azzure was like running an auction house, sub-site, doing nothing but auction house stuff. And I was like, auction house is terrible, it's ruining the game. And you're like, oh no, it's awesome, it's the greatest thing ever. Now we're like exactly the opposite. But anyway, so final point on items, Wolfpaq. You want to throw anything else in here before we move on?
I mean, I have earned more gold through selling in the auction house than I have from picking up gold, and so I have a hard time differentiating between finding a good item, selling it on the auction house, and then buying a good item for me, and finding a good item for me. Like, to me, that's the same thing. If I sell a great item for 10 million gold and I spend that 10 million gold on an upgrade for me, to me that is just as good as finding that item myself. So I don't have a problem with it, but a lot of people do, and I really don't mind these fixes they're doing, like the crafting changes they made in the last patch. I think it's awesome. The demonic essences. I can see why they wanted to make these overpowered crafts available for people who want to hunt the demonic essences themselves. So yeah, if they can make the game more interesting, I'm all for it.
Weren't you just arguing against that a minute ago? Basically, you're saying it's really fun if I find an Echoing Fury that's 1100, and Azure's like, well, you can buy those for 10K in the auction house, and you're like, but I want to find them.
No, I mean, wait, say your point again.
You were just arguing that it was much more fun to find stuff than to buy it in the auction house, like 10 minutes ago.
No, I don't mind selling something I found and then using that gold to buy something for myself. It is more fun. I mean, it is a lot of fun to find an 1100 DPS Echoing Fury, but that doesn't mean I'm opposed to buying it if I find, what's it called, the Demon Hunter crossbow, or a really good Wind Force, and sell that. Calamity. There you go. If I found a Calamity and sold it and bought an Echoing Fury, I think that's fun too. But to me, it's not that different than running and trading runes in Diablo 2. There was a time in Diablo 2 when I was collecting nothing but perfect gems and trading 40 perfect gems for like medium range high runes, and then trading
those. That was actually fun.
And then trading those medium high runes off for gear for me to use. To me, that's no more or less fun than doing it with a real currency.
That sounds like my fragment system, Flux.
Yeah, that's a terrible idea. Next podcast for that. Okay, so we've been doing items for 50 minutes here. We need to get a couple of other topics in. Improving the co-op experience. That's another big point they've been beating to death lately, making glue from, and we've all been talking about that forever. And the main complaint in Diablo 3 is that you don't really get any benefits for playing in a party. And I was reading articles about that in literally 2008. I read a couple of articles. There aren't enough shared skills. We need some more stuff like, Oak Sage and fanaticism and stuff. And the game came out, and none of that had been changed, and no one plays in parties. And they keep saying, we want to improve this. And they've lowered the hit point increase monsters get, since the launch. And they keep saying they're going to make other stuff change, and it's not really happening yet. Yeah. So do you guys play multiplayer, and what would you like to see added to make it more fun? More experience, more items, more MF, what?
I do play multiplayer quite often, just with a friend or two.
That's StarCraft, though. I mean Diablo 3.
Both. I don't I'm not necessarily opposed to how it currently works. I think people's expectations might be a bit odd. Like a lot of people probably want to play public games and want to be able to jump in a public game and play properly. Now, just human nature is probably not going to, no matter what Blizzard do, that's not going to really help because you got people, especially if you're not on, Skype or something with them, you're not talking to them, they might have real life stuff going on. They might get up and get a drink, and you can't really you can't. It's very difficult logistically to play with a group of strangers and do so effectively with fun and with having no issues. Playing with friends is different. I think for the most part that works okay as it is. The monsters aren't any stronger. It's probably more efficient for most people. What I do think could be done for the game itself in terms of public, mixing in with the public is not so much the actual gameplay, the co-op gameplay, but the actual BattleNet interface itself. So something like, I know this has been suggested many times, but to have like a city in the game, so turn the BattleNet lobby into a city, and an in-game city where your character runs around and there's, you're in a chat channel and there's an auctioneer and you can click on that guy to get the auction house. A bit like what you would see in like a World of Warcraft city. And then you can see everyone else, like or almost everyone else. You see a few hundred other players running around as well, and you can talk to them, you can inspect them, you can compare your builds with them. And that's the kind of social features I think Blizzard should be focusing on rather than this co-op stuff. Because with that unlocks also the ability to do co-op stuff. You can run around and see a group of people and say, do you guys want to run into, do you want to do this together? And then that's a good way of finding people and networking and finding new friends and stuff like that. So I think that's the way they should pursue the social side of the game rather than trying to make co-op even easier, which I think they don't really need to do anymore.
Wolfpaq?
Yeah, I play. I mean, I'll agree with most of what was said there. I play with my friends, and it's awesome. I mean, co-op's awesome. Like monks, particularly, are really really fun to play with. They can do all sorts of crazy things like drawing in monsters for my AOE, or I also play with a critical mass wizard regularly who just we can bump up the monster power difficulty ridiculously, and she just keeps all the monsters frozen while I'm, dumping over cluster bombs on them. But I think that the biggest draw and biggest appeal of co-op the game has right now is Ubers. And the problem with Ubers is that it's not, I mean, you have one item that you really run Ubers to get, and it's a lot of work to get that one item. So I think that they've sort of dropped off the radar as far as things that people want to work on. And but I remember back when Ubers first came out, like there were tons of posts on pretty much every Diablo forum you could think of, people saying, "Hey, let's group up, let's key hunt, let's I've got a machine, you've got a machine, let's do it." But now, when all you've got is a monster power times 10% of getting 1/3 of a ring to craft, it's just not enough. I think that they should, add some serious rewards to Ubers as a way of encouraging people, because hunting keys by yourself is boring and monotonous, but hunting keys with a group is actually really fun. If they gave us other rewards for killing Ubers other than, just a chance at getting a piece of one ring that is unique equipped, I think that they should. That would be another way to encourage co-op.
Uber's being part of the Hellfire Ring plan and the Infernal Machine, if someone doesn't somehow know that by now, but don't you have enough Hellfire Rings? Are you still looking for more? Or are you just hoping for a perfect roll?
I mean, I could always get a better roll. My roll's not fantastic. It's good. It's not great.
Yeah, I mean, I have like 5 of them, and I just haven't even bothered looking for them because they're good enough. I mean, obviously they could be better, but
I've got one for my Merc for when I'm soloing, so I get the extra 7% XP boost.
yeah, all my mercs have them. All my crappy ones are on the mercs. So it's funny because you guys, at least you're, especially Wolfpack here, you both seem like you're more into the social things and what they can change on the overall. And all my thoughts were much like what Blizzard's been saying, where they're looking at more like game mechanics. Like people have often suggested allowing more Nephilim Valor stacks in multiplayer. Like you get, 6, 8, and 10 with 2, 3, 4 players, something like that. Or you get more experience or whatever. And neither of you guys seems to be real big on that.
If they do that, then the opposite thing's going to happen. People who like soloing, which at the moment is probably the majority, are going to be angry at the fact that the most efficient way is now the way they don't really like to do, which is co-op. And I'm probably one of those people because there's nothing worse for me than having to go into a public game with strangers. Half of them are not even AFK, the other half are, MP0 that are actually an MP5 for some reason. So it's a bit of a nightmare for me having that scenario happen.
Okay, so you're gonna love my suggestion here.
Oh god.
A passive bonus from each class that's different for each one. And if you're within the experience sharing range, which is like 50 yards, you get this bonus. And it's something like 5 to 10% to Demon Hunter adds attack speed, Barb adds hit points, Monk adds faster movement speed, Witch Doctor adds resource regeneration, Wizard adds critical hit chance. Something like that. So if you're in a party with a Monk and a Barb and a Wizard, you're getting 10% more movement speed, critical hit speed, and hit points.
Will it stack?
What if you're with 4 barbs?
Sure.
Then,
Sure, you get 40% hit
yes,
points
I
then.
agree. Let's do it.
I actually
You like
actually
that.
like it.
But wouldn't
It's
that
nice.
make it mandatory to play multiplayer?
Well,
then?
it's like the follower auras,
Yeah, it's basically
except
it's basically a
a
follow
little
bonus.
bit tougher. I think that'd be really cool. I would not be opposed to that.
Huh, okay, well, I'll pencil that in with my next Milsim meeting with
Awesome.
Wyatt. Okay, last point, monster density. That's the other big thing everyone's been bitching about forever. Why don't one of you guys explain what the problem with monster density is today for people who maybe aren't doing farming and all through
There are not
Inferno
enough
yet?
monsters. The end.
And what does that mean?
No, so
In which
So
act are there
Act
enough
3
monsters?
obviously is the most popular act because there's a very high amount of both elites and monsters themselves, very high density, and there is nothing better than killing many, many monsters and not having to run through a long period where there's no monsters, which is a problem with Act 1, 2, and 4. So basically everyone's doing Act 3 at the moment and no one's really doing Act 1, 2, and 4 because there is literally not enough density in them. How is
And
that?
the suggestions that Blizzard has said they're working on increasing the density. I really noticed monster density some months ago when I started doing a lot more farming, and I was doing a Demon Hunter as my main character for a long time, and didn't really notice it that much. I mean, it was nice when there were more, but it wasn't that big a difference. But then I started doing a little bit of the Spin to Win Barb, and especially doing my Tempest Rush Monk, and you literally can't do some builds unless you get enough monsters to keep your resource regeneration. You need things to hit, to kill, to gain resource to do what you're doing. And you literally can't do those builds in some of the acts where there aren't enough monsters. And it's not like it's just slower. I mean, it doesn't even work. And it's like, this sucks. I can't even play this character in this act. And they're saying they're going to try to improve increase the number of monsters. There'll be lots more things to kill. But of course, the problem there is, does it work with the level designs? I wrote a big article about this back in January. And if you look at like an Act 3, there are levels that are very popular and levels that are less popular. Like for instance, the Fields of Misery, or is it Despair? I forget. Whatever, the outdoor one where you go around in the big circle,
Slaughter.
basically. Yeah, Slaughter. God knows. It's Fields of something. Fields of Green. If you build it, they will come. But it's a really fun level because it's a big damn donut, basically, and you run around the outside very quickly. If that was one long, like, plus shape, like some of those levels in Act 2 where you're in, like, Zoltan Kuhl's tomb and stuff, and it's like, Zoltan Kuhl described his levels as being like, he built them to test things, to test humans and for his experiments. And I've always wondered if his experiment was with seeing how far he had to walk to find a bathroom. Because those levels are just freaking If there were 100 times monster density, it would still suck. Because it's just these super long dead ends everywhere, and you have to keep constantly backtracking. And that seems like the problem to me with a lot of Act 1 and Act 2, is even if they vastly increase the monster density, like those crypts, the crypts in underneath Act 1 kind of thing. And you run 50 yards, or the catacombs, there's these huge long dead ends. Even if there's like 20 times the zombies, oh boy, I've just killed 1,000 zombies and I've got to run back for 2 minutes to get to the next,
No, they have the things you can click that teleport you right to the entrance.
Yeah, well, some of them was the end of it. I mean, even like Cathedral 3 and 4, when you're trying to find the stairs, there's long-ass dead ends all over the place. And so that's why I just have thought it would be easier to do bonus dungeons that are kind of like an Infernal Machine thing, where it's like a 10 or a 15 or 20 level dungeon, or bottomless, like the chili cheese fries at Bennigan's. And you just keep getting more stuff, and it keeps getting harder, and you can and if you have bottomless dungeons, you can put things in them that you can't put in the regular game. Like you can put rooms with there's like 4 boss monsters all together, or champion groups of like 8 champions at once, or a room full of treasure goblins, or a room with 4 Ubers, that kind of stuff. You can't just stick that into Cathedral 2 on the way down to the Skeleton King. But you can put it in special dungeons, and you can change up the damn dungeon layouts, which I think we're all really sick of the same dungeon layouts. So now that I've been explaining this for 45 minutes, when do you guys jump in?
I think that you're right. Like there's a lot of wasted potential I find with a lot of the level design. The thing you mentioned with the bottomless dungeon, I mean, how cool would that be? You go in and every 5 levels there's like the next level's just filled with say elites or goblins or whatever, and have a bit of
Or you go
predictability. Yeah,
treasure room.
and there's a lot of potential I think they could have, and something I would like to see in terms of them changing the acts like they are going to is why not have something like Act 4 has less monster density, but it actually has a lot more elites, for example, or the bosses. There's a lot more actual bosses which drop really, really good loot, like similar like what Mephisto used to drop, and make Act 4 like if you like to kill bosses, go to Act 4. If you like to kill lots of monsters, go to Act 3. And just give flavors to these acts, if you know what I mean. So give them a sort of flavor
Hmm.
and some kind of benefit that something that you enjoy doing. You might be doing Act 3 for a week and you're like, hey, I'm sick of this. I want to kill some bosses now. And then you go to the Act 4 bosses and there's lots of bosses everywhere and there's less density, but there's actually more bosses. So your build might, be good for that or might be good for the other thing. But I just wish there was a bit more variance in terms of random events and things like that as well, which I feel they've wasted a lot of potential on.
Okay, Wolfpaq, tell us why we're both correct. Tell us how much you love our
I
ideas.
I think that the biggest problem is that everyone's in Act Three and they're sick of Act Three, and there's three other acts that have really cool environments and
Well,
yeah,
2.5.
yeah, but no one's there because it's just not efficient. And in my opinion, the best solution, other than bumping up density in Acts 1, 2, and 4, which I think they should do to be at least close to Act 3, because right now no, they're nowhere close, but would be to let us go between Act 3 and between the acts, in the same game. And that's one of the things I've been asking.
Well, you can, but just
Right.
one at a
No, I mean, I
time.
want to be able. I mean, I've been asking for this for a while. Is some sort of open world mode or free farm mode where every purple boss is up and every waypoint is active and you can just go through and pick it apart at your leisure, because to me that's the biggest difference between farming in D3 and D2. And even though farming in D2 was not the most fun, it was still because
I love Meth runs.
yeah, well, you were going, you saw Mephisto's room, you saw Bale's room, you saw the steps with the council in Act 3. Like you went all over the place in Diablo 2, and even though you were skipping everything you possibly could to get to the bosses, you still had variety. Versus now, you have the depths level 2, the core level 2, and the fields of slaughter or whatever they are, and that's it. That you may do Stone Fort or the Sky Crown, but it really that's it, and it's really sort of suffocating. Like I would love, and I would love it too if these purple bosses were more than just a couple crappy blues. Like they should at least give you the quality of drops that elites do. I don't see why they hate purple bosses so much to
Some,
make them
some,
worthless.
something I don't understand.
And they're so weak too. That's the weirdest thing. I mean, they have like special abilities. You have to stand there and watch them before they
Yeah,
ever do any of them. You're like, oh my god, he could do illusion. Who knew?
yeah.
You know?
Something
Like I've never not killed him in 4 seconds before. He's actually doing cool stuff now.
Look, something I don't understand is why they didn't make boss drops like the actual act bosses. Why their drops are so, they're probably a little bit worse, or probably, sorry, a little bit better than an average elite. I would have liked to have, it actually takes a bit of time to get to them, especially if you're killing everything on the way, which you do.
Well, not Asmodean, the
Yeah,
other
I mean,
ones.
it would have been nice to have like a sort of, you finally finished the act, you finished your run, and it would be nice to have a sort of pinata, loot pinata that drops really, quite good gear at the end of it, just to sort of be the
Yeah,
cherry on top of the cake. And that would be, I'm very surprised they didn't do something like that, because it's not like D2 where you could actually just skip straight to that boss in, 10 seconds. You actually have to fight through some areas. I mean, the closest waypoint can be quite far away. So I think they should have done that because they could do that without ruining the balance of the game.
yeah,
There's almost always a really long hallway, so
and you
that's a
have to
nice
watch a
feature.
cutscene, so there's that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if I like to run up a few more stairs to get to Diablo, that'd be awesome.
You have to watch your companion get bone
Yeah.
prisons.
Yes, they only do that once, and if you die and you come back and you restart, you don't even have a companion. They're like, yeah, we're not going
Yeah.
to show you that twice. You get the idea. The other thing that seems like it's gonna be weird if they increase the monster density in Acts 1 and 2. 2, I think it'll work sort of, but 1 is kind of a problem with some. I mean, in theory, there's like, they have this beautifully designed game and like the progress and the rate of the monsters you see and stuff. I mean, obviously they spent years polishing it, literally
Yeah.
spent years polishing it, as they claim. And so if you're suddenly like it kind of makes sense in terms of how many monsters there are. Like Act 3, it's like hell is vomiting
Yeah.
forth its
Yeah.
legions. There should be billions. If you go to Act 1 and you see like 1,000 cultists in one level of this dungeon, it's like, where did all these cultists come from? It's like a cultist academy, like at some other part in the world, they're like rigging them in on boats.
I'm okay with it.
Like what's the burning city? Fordham, Farnham?
Oh yeah,
In
yeah.
Act
Oh,
1 when you
yeah.
see the ferryman
Yeah.
over. Whatever that, you go there, there's like 20 cultists in the streets and the town's on fire and stuff like it makes sense. And what if you go there now and there's like 150 cultists, like you just wall to wall down the street, like scorpions in Act 3? You're gonna be like, what is this? It would just. I mean, obviously it's just Inferno, and everyone's kind of seen the game a million
Yeah.
times already. But it seems like they're kind of screwing up their artistic
I
vision
think
for this
that's the
stuff.
biggest counter to what you're saying is that by Inferno we're seeing everything for the fourth time. Like it's okay if we encounter
4,000
1,000 zombies
people,
on our run to Tristram, like when we first started. Like that's okay because we've gotten the point from the first three that okay, there's a couple zombies eating corpses here outside of town. We get it. Like
Do you remember seeing pictures from the beta when like you could get illusionists and they would keep making more and more?
yes.
Yeah.
And there'd be like literally like a 500 zombies on one screen, just the same boss like 500 times, just sitting there. There were some fun visuals of that. Maybe we'll see that again.
Yeah, or the people who would, back when the monsters who spawned would not stop spawning. So to get ridiculous kill spree bonuses, they would like spend an hour setting it up, running around, having, you know,
Yeah, the Weeping Hollow
Yeah.
for like an hour and a half, just getting all the vomiting zombies to
exactly.
make more. Okay, last point. You guys have probably noticed suddenly we're getting direct conversation from the developers, Travis and Wyatt, and the community managers are posting a lot as well. And is this a welcome change?
Very welcome change.
Are we happy? Are they doing this out of desperation? Are they turning over a new leaf with their PR operations?
All of the
Well,
above, I think.
Yeah, 1.08 sounds awesome. I mean, I wasn't expecting to hear anything from them again for like months since 1.07 just came out, but it's really good to hear their plans for 1.08. Give us something to look forward to.
Like they saw their shadow and that was it? Six more months of a long cold winter. Of course, you live in Southern California. You don't
It
have
rained
cold
today.
winters. Yeah, for like
Yeah.
5 seconds probably.
Look, it was either that or the things you mentioned, or they probably looked at how well the game actually sold and thought, okay, well, we actually have a huge player base here. It's rivals WoW's player base in terms of sales and in terms of size. Now, if we want to build this player base and keep them quite happy and that sort of stuff, then we can't just ignore them like we have been. We have to start focusing a bit more resources on, they're probably looking at because they have all these kinds of stats and stuff like that on BattleNet. They're probably seeing that a lot of people, the retention rate is probably lower than what, say, WoW would be or their other games have been in the past. So they're probably trying to look at strategies of trying to see what's causing this sort of stuff. And again, they're sitting on a massive asset, which is a humongous player base. I mean, Diablo's community is probably bigger than WoW, I think, in terms of, because it's free, in terms of popularity. So I think it's something to do with them recognizing that and thinking, what can we do better to make the community stronger and stronger?
Yeah, that's very true. And they have a BlizzCon coming up this year. I would be very shocked if they aren't announcing a Diablo expansion at it. So, probably want to start ramping up interest in the game a little earlier.
Yeah.
And there was obviously a lot of negativity. The Jay Wilson had a few controversial comments. I don't recall what they were at this point, but something about losers.
Yeah.
I forget exactly. And obviously Bashiak had become sort of soaked in kerosene, where his every utterance was met with scorns and howls of derision and such. And so they kind of shipped those guys off to other projects, and they brought in like these the CMs now are all like super positive and friendly, and thanks for your feedback, and it's harder. The poo flinging has lessened definitely on BattleNet. It seems like.
Yeah, well, they're addressing one of the core problems of in my opinion, the biggest problem of the game, which is the items. it's been the problem since day one. Even before day one, the months before the game was released, when they opened the database up for everyone to look at it,
Yeah.
and everyone was like, "What are these crappy
Warning
items?"
signs, yeah.
And they were like,
There was
"Oh, well,
so many warning
work in
signs.
progress, work in progress," and then they just
Yeah.
shut it down. But it was, and then it came out, and it hadn't changed at all. It was so they're finally addressing that complaint, which, and as a huge Diablo fan, it makes me extremely happy and optimistic for the next patch.
Yeah, they've been making many comments, and I've been saying in the posts about them. It's like they're saying exactly what we want them to say. They seem to get it. They seem to agree with most of the fans on these opinions, and of course we'll see if any of these things actually get optimized in the game and it really improves. I mean, it's easy to say yes, you guys are right. It's harder to make changes in the game to correspond to what we all want. But luckily, they can look at what all the modders have been doing and just kind of copy the best plans and the best strategies, and they can get us some really good kind of hands-on advice that way. So I think it'll work out really well. Agreed. Okay. Well, you've been listening to the Diablo podcast. We are online at diabloinkgamers.com, and thanks for showing up, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Moo. Secret moo level.